Good evening. Thank you for that introduction. Professor at Bentley University also. And I want to thank Dr. Gay and McGarity first for inviting me to this lecture at CKC. Also to Jay Hunt for facilitating this presentation, and to all of you, of course, for participating in this session today. Today I'm going to talk about what I call transgressive ecosystems and statetropic criminality in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and I promise to explain a little bit more about those terms later. Let me just say, as Mr. Hunt just introduced it, that this presentation is based on my ongoing comparative research on organized crimes and violence in these two Caribbean countries. And this is a study that is sponsored by the Drug Security and Democracy Fellowship of Open Society and the Social Science Research Council. Well, you may wonder, why did I choose Puerto Rico, which for the general knowledge is considered to be part of the US? Well, on one hand, Puerto Rico is in a sort of limbo on the study of organized crime in Latin America and the Caribbean because its jurisdictional status. On the other hand, it is a poorly researched subject even in North America academia, and all these vacuums was sort of appealing enough to me to study. In addition to that, as Caribbean countries, Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic have many things in common besides the language, the geography, and the cultural background. They also share similar patterns of inequality, social exclusion, and citizen disenfranchisement. Especially in both places of immigration and immigration with high level of poverty. Also, despite the fact that Puerto Rico is a U.S. Commonwealth territory within the strong jurisdiction of enforcement forces such as the DEA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, the country still experienced, like in the case of the Dominican Republic, serious institutional weakness, especially regarding the state police and the penal system. So the level of crime and complex crime are in both places high and growing. And finally, I will say that a strong parallels between criminogenic ecosystem in the two islands will suggest that the local dynamics is robustly impervious to control by the state, whether a sovereign but weak state in the Dominican case, or a Caribbean outpost of the United States in the case of Puerto Rico. Now, regarding my research methodology, since violence and crime statistics are not so robust, especially in the Dominican Republic, I conducted field research for several months in the metropolitan areas of San Juan and Santo Domingo, gathering information through qualitative and quantitative methods. The study produced a relevant amount of data that I just begin processing about facts and perceptions of insecurity, victimization, violence, and drug trafficking among low, middle, and high-income citizens. I also explored changing patterns of complex criminality, as well as the incidence of criminal and violent actors, and the role of the state on reconstituting new social orders while reshaping criminogenic logics and dynamics. Now, let me go beyond this background information and talk about what I'm going to present today to you. Today I will present preliminary findings of my study. Second, I will introduce the most recent criminogenic trends in the Caribbean. I will give a glimpse of the conceptual framework I have developed. Then I will present some of the social and political impacts that organized crime and drug trafficking have in both societies. And then I think that we can all discuss a little bit on policy's approach and possibilities at the end. One of my preliminary findings that emerged from my study is that in vulnerable social and political environments, as small Caribbean societies are, the overlap between criminal and non-criminal elements fades. Despite its negative association, criminal and illicit activities such as drug trafficking, armed and drug-related violence, extortion, and racketeering attract multiple beneficiaries who tolerate and propel them either as a survival mechanism or a continuing lucrative sources of income, or as a mechanism of political empowerment. Second, ordinary people, state officials, and local political class conform and accommodate to reified social orders based on new social arrangements, norms, and institutions. However, at the local level, this accommodation does not always imply unconditional subordination. There are moments of tension and implicit limits that local people impose over violent and illicit groups, as they also need to support, and these groups need the support and the incorporation to their business to that environment. Third, in local context, complex criminality combines elements of organized and disorganized opportunistic crime. It also deploys regulatory violence by criminals, the police, and the military. Fourth, changes in the criminogenic pattern in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic manifest themselves both at the macro and micro levels of their states and society, and usually they are interconnected. Regarding, for example, the macro level, organized crime and drug trafficking had permeated different sectors of the economic, administrative, and political systems by prompting the involvement of public and private actors as facilitators, promoters, and beneficiaries of criminal activities. Locally, Puerto Rico and Dominican politicians and authorities get into the profitable business of using the power and influence exerted by narco-entrepreneurs to recruit sympathizers, votes, to gain political control, and to attract financial support for their campaigns. And fifth, generally speaking, the specialized literature on organized crime and transnational drug economies tend to focus on actors, markets, routes, and volumes. However, as much as this approach contributes to understanding the geopolitical economy of crime, they usually don't explain much about how these enterprises and networks percolate and become recursive to the endurance of local economies, societies, and political structure. Finally, most of the government policies in the region regarding these issues often entail simplistic measures of intervention, suppression, and encapsulation of drug-plagued communities, leaving aside more systemic factors that promote new transgressive social orders. As I mentioned, these are sort of compacted interpretation of my findings. Now, let's look at a brief contextualization of current trends related to organized crime in the Caribbean geopolitics, where Puerto Rican and the Dominican realities are situated. The first relevant trend is the reemergence of the Caribbean as an important conduit of drug, a niche for proliferating retail markets, and as a hub for drug traffickers and associated illicit functions. The second trend relates to the systematic use of instrumental violence by multiple public and private actors, which has resulted in a condition of chronic, systemic, and institutionalized violence in these societies. Third, there is a social, political, and institutional embeddedness of complex criminality in Caribbean societies, which is based on the diversification of criminal agents and the intensification of organized crime enterprise. And finally, such features in turn contribute to the formation and reinforcement of alternative social orders and the reorientation of complex criminality toward the state. I will come back to these tendencies later. I just wanted to point out, however, that in approaching these issues from a broader Caribbean perspective, we must remember that the Caribbean archipelago is an extremely fragmented cartography with 28 countries and overseas territories of diverse size and political jurisdiction status, plus around 700 small islands, cays, and non-inhabited locations. So within this diversity, there are significant differences among countries in terms of the following areas that I highlighted in this next slide. The economic and development achievement, their capacity of implementing comprehensive security policy to protect citizens, the effectiveness of those mechanisms to prevent and enforce security, the type of political and administrative arrangement with other countries and regions, like some kind of arrangement like CARICOM, impacts, the regional security system, the integrated system of Central America. So let's start with the first trend that we were talking about, the coming back of the Caribbean as an important conduit of drugs. And I apologize that this slide doesn't have the data, but it's a very recent one. And here I wanted to stress out that despite these territories are generally considered drug transit countries, they are, in fact, more than that. They not only function as a transshipment point, but they basically become deeply affected by the role that they play in the international criminal economy. According to the U.S. federal authorities, the Caribbean is currently responsible for 30% of the drugs that enter U.S. territory from the Caribbean. How does that happen? Since the Caribbean corridor lost its relevance as a transshipment route during the 80s. Well, by the time Colombia was the main center of drug trafficking activities as drug producer and supplier, it became a major U.S. target for containment. U.S. policies were effective on breaking down the hegemony of Colombian cartels and the consequential fragmentation of what is called baby cartels. This was an important tipping point in the transformation of criminal structures working in the Pacific and Caribbean areas. Criminal entities start operating under more loose and diversified arrangements such as networks and groups and nodes. These recomposed entities reflected process of dispersion and concentration via cooperation between Mexican cartels, Colombian and Venezuelan networks that were searching and opening new routes toward the U.S. market while revitalizing old ones. As you can see in the chart, by the end of the 80s to the present, Mexican and Central American routes becomes predominant in the smuggling of cocaine and other hard drugs, as shown in this chart. But at this time, the narco enterprise tended to be more widespread, reinforced by criminal diaspora located in the eastern part of U.S., Europe, and within the region. Let me just say that the next slide. This brought back the Caribbean region as a conduit into a much more complex narco-cartography. And I apologize that this is in Spanish, but basically I just wanted to focus on the place that the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico were playing precisely in the new dynamic. And it brought back the Caribbean region as a conduit into a much more complex narco-cartography. Take, for example, the unprecedented presence of a Sinaloa cartel cell that was successfully operating in the DR territory, gathering logistics support, precursors, and intermediaries before being dismantled by the Dominican authority in 2012. Previous to this finding, counter-drug forces confirmed that important cadres of the Zeta in Hidalgo, a cell under the command of El Chapo Guzman, the famous Chapo Guzman, was operating through the Dominican Republic and Panama. I'm not going to enter into those details. Enough to say that between 2005 and 2009, the Dominican Republic ranked the third country after Brazil and Argentina in cocaine sales in its transit toward Europe. And here is showed in this chart how it had been growing. Of course, the data for 2013 is incomplete. Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic rapidly become hubs for associated criminal activities such as money laundering, extortion, and racketeering, and a need for drug traffickers to hide, storage illicit merchandise, generate logistic and planning for their criminal enterprise. In few years, both countries were not only exporting to the U.S. and Europe around 70% of the drugs that circulate through their territory, but they were also creating a mushrooming market with the rest of the drugs that were paid in kind and stayed in the islands. And these were enough drugs to foment a competitive environment that became associated to the increasing violence, especially in port entries and urban areas. As the governor of Puerto Rico explained, the excess of cocaine supply that remains inland feeds a lucrative stateside market. Market saturation also leads to price dropping and greater internal demand, a circular mechanism that put out of business several intermediaries while incentivizing violent competition among remaining rivals for supremacy. Even though most of these of the profit still stay closer to the high consumption market, the inflow and outflow of thousands of kilos of cocaine generated a sort of polarized scenario with significant profit for some few influential national economic and political actors on one hand, and on the other hand, it created micro markets based on nationwide low-pay informal but highly risky employment. Needless to say that the accommodation of these trends by regional political and economic elites, along with the fact that these constrained Caribbean economies are thriving with illicit money, constitute a major dilemma that their governments and societies face. What is relatively new outcome is the impact that these trends have had in reshaping social order, affecting the social fabric and the state's configuration, as well as the relationship between both realms. Almost without exception in the region, crime toll have raised as a consequence of the proliferation of drugs, risky and competitive street markets, flourishing all over national territories, coastal ports, shanty towns, and poor neighborhoods in urban areas, where violence tends to concentrate. Usually, those lower level stakeholders are the solely target of authorities, while the big sources and flow of illicit capital remain untouched. Let's talk then about those violent trends now. I'm going to pass to the next table. In this slide, you can see that over the past decade, the Caribbean subregion has ranked among the most violent in the world. Countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago experienced a high toll of 59 and 42 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, respectively, in 2008. And this is showing the next graphic. Despite a modest decrease in the subsequent years, by 2011, some of those countries doubled the American homicide rates, which was 15.6 per 100,000 in 2010, while others, including the smallest nation of St. Kitts, Nevis, Santa Lucia, and Guyana, even tripled. As said, this outbreak of violence is considered to be associated to drug trafficking and other manifestations of organized crime, although a repertoire of complementing factors also account, ranking from structural and systemic ones like poverty, inequality, and corruption, to institutional factors like lacking enforcement capacity, and situational factors such as access to weapons and the presence of criminal gangs, among others. The next chart suggests that there is a positive correlation between cocaine seizure, and this is just basically for three countries, Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. That there are certain correlation between cocaine seizure and homicide rates in selected countries, which could be related to high competition in scenarios of drug shortening. And this is probably most true for Jamaica and Trinidad that were big exporter of marijuana in the case of Jamaica. But as you can see in the case of the Dominican Republic, which is also a big transition for cocaine, it's different. With the highest level of cocaine seizure, it appears to be no correlation. The growing pattern of homicides looks constant no matter how much drug is interdicted. This pattern could also reflect a more complex scenario where violent competition is highly concentrated and controlled. These outcomes suggest that even when having an extensive effect, drug enterprise does not necessarily involve extreme or explicit violence if other sources of intimidation or cooptation could be implemented to keep business going. Or even if the market is very well compacted organized, that can also reduce the level of violence. Part of this criminal violence had been carried out by virulent gangs who have defied the limits of the state internal sovereignty in countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Santa Lucia, and Belize, to the point of obliging regional governments to declare a state of siege as a way to resume spatial control of slums, garrison, and marginalized urban areas. In Jamaica, it has been documented that half of the 1,680 murders that occurred in 2009 were reported to be intra-gangs and inter-feud gangs related. In the case of the Dominican Republic, as you can see in this chart, some of the social impact of this relevant role of the country as a growing criminal agent on the international criminal economy are reflected on the official statistic of crime. Lethal violence increased, first gradually and then sharply. This trend, as you can see in the peak here in 2005, between 2004 and 2005, and that was accentuated from 2000, which was more or less low level. That was an election year that produced a shift in the government elites also. So there could be some elements there of recomposition of some kind of arrangement with political class. Despite internal annual fluctuation by 2012, death rate is, which is not shown here, but it's the same that it was at the most critical moment of eruption. So we Dominicans went back to the situation that we were in 2004, which was the peak time. And when compared with the rest of Latin American and Caribbean countries, whose homicide rates was registered as 15.5 per 100,000, the Dominican Republic occupies an intermediary position in the scale of violent death and victimization. Despite its intermediary position, Dominican Republic is included within the group of countries where the population see delinquency and insecurity as the two most serious problems. Now let's check what happened in Puerto Rico, and this is a chart that basically doesn't show most of the tendency in Puerto Rico, but I wanted to point out about San Juan, which were the place where I did my research. As you can see, like it happened in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, the eruption of crime and violence has become a major issue in recent years. In 2011, Puerto Ricans living in the island, which were 3.7 million inhabitants, experienced a mirrored scenario that Dominicans in 2004, suffering the highest rate of violent death in the last 7 decades and a 17% increase in violent crime from 2007 to 2009. Despite the already high annual homicide rates of 19 per 100,000 registered between 1980 and 2005, by 2011, that average escalated to 30.5 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. This rate is higher than Mexico, which at that point was 24 per 100,000, and 6 times higher than the rest of the United States. Compared with the precedent year of 2010, Puerto Rico experienced an increase of 15% of violent deaths. Most of that violence had been attributed to drug transaction and activities. This lethal violence affects mostly young poor males, placing Puerto Rico in the 6th position worldwide in youth homicides, that teeny small island. It also tends to concentrate in the public developments located in the center as well as the peripheral areas of the urban centers and around the modern highways that circumvent the metropolitan San Juan. As you can see in the chart, San Juan occupied the first place in terms of the level of violence. And with a population of barely 500,000, that municipality registered the highest density of crime and criminal groups, ranking from number 26 among the top 50 more violent cities in Latin America and the Caribbean. In to exemplify, in just one warm and bloody June weekend, 25 killing broke the record of violence in the small geography of San Juan. The examination of these two cases then shows that patterns of violence reaffirm themselves locally through the diversification of criminal activities and actors, public and private. So I argue that this pattern results from a process of negative adaptation to changes experienced within the illicit political economy of competitive drug trafficking and marketing. As part of the organized crime network's repertoire of violent practices, kidnappings and sicariatos, or killers for hire, have become a serious matter in countries where they hardly existed before, especially in the case of the Dominican Republic, Trinidad and Tobago, and Haiti. Now that we have examined pattern of organized crime and organized violence in Caribbean countries, let's unfold my theoretical interpretation of how embedded these patterns are within the states and societies, and how the formation and reinforcement of alternative social orders reorient complex criminality toward the state at the point that the state ends up reshaping crime. For those contained within the relationship among agency and their social political context. One of these concepts is what I call transgressive ecosystems, TA, a social spatial construct, based on interactions of organized and opportunistic criminal and illicit actors and activities that establish symbiotic and functional relations as a way to negotiate power and benefits. As you can see in the slide, TAs involve a series of political, economic, cultural, and relational factors that interconnect illicit and illicit forms and informal institution activities and actors, prompting instrumental violence in urban fragile environments. However, through them, benefits are also widely distributed. They crystallize themselves territorially through exchange and arrangement between unregulated private actors, such as gang members, petty criminals, and former politicians, bureaucrats, police forces, and prosecutors. Within this transgressive ecosystem, there are rules and implicit agreements. For example, in one of the focus groups with community leaders in San Juan, one participant admitted that when the community plans some social or cultural activity, we do inform about that to the head of the puntos of selling drugs. Other participants made clear that that doesn't mean that we are asking for their permission. We are just informing them to avoid any conflict of violent acts. So daily life in the barrios is saturated with these bifurcated discourses, especially when violence is so ubiquitous that either become normalized or made people resilient by finding ways how to avoid to be hurt and how to develop a small collective responses. By exploring what organized crime means to the poor population in concrete quotidian terms, my research seeks to explain how drug dealers turn marginalized neighborhoods into transgressive ecosystems. In this regard, the idea that some places becomes ungoverned, like there had been a lot of discussion on that in the recent literature, does not always reflect the implicit arrangement that formal institutional actors establish with informal and illicit ones. As I argue in the two countries case I study, the power exerted by criminals is based not only on violence and intimidation, but also on accommodation to the political and social stimulants. In the process, values, social arrangement, and survival mechanism of the people living in those environments also change. People become tolerant of, and in many cases complicit with, the new norms and practices that have been stipulated as criminal by formal laws. An example of that is what I found in the barriadas, or in the slums of Puerto Rico and San Juan, and in the marginalized slums of Dominican Republic. There, gangs become the epitome of violence, and young people are stigmatized as factual or potential delinquents by both the community and the police. The main sources of social conflict and violent confrontations are the retail selling of drugs. There are dozens of selling points in each barrio, and they are generally controlled by gang members. Most of the time, gang leaders are rather intermediaries and owners of drugs that they distribute in the selling points. And sometimes somebody monopolizes the distribution of drugs in big areas of San Juan and Santo Domingo, and that could help to organize the retail market and control violence more than when there is a more fragmented ownership. In most of this neighborhood, however, with high rates of unemployment, economic affluence gravitate around the drug selling points. They are the source of income that keep the people, the local business alive. Likewise, in absence of security provision by the state, they become providers of security, especially in the case of the public developments of caseríos in Puerto Rico, where there are frequent confrontation among gangs that comes from other caseríos to dispute the local distribution of drugs. In these scenarios, the police play a very serious role. But gangs are not only unregulated violent actors within transgressive ecosystem. In fact, the police, that we already characterize as a major promoter of institutional violence, is also a catalytic of criminal activities. And these two pictures are a good example of how is the interaction between people in the communities and the police. And it's an incredible picture because in Spanish it says "coopere con la policía, mátese" in the wall, which means cooperate with the police, kill yourself. And it's happening while this other unfolding act is going on. So this is a very representative of the kind of daily interaction in those communities. For me, it was shocking to learn how much the police is considered to be part of the problem rather than the solution. In most of my interview with Puerto Rican and Dominican residents of low-income neighborhoods, there were similar stories about how the police tax the puntos, or the selling points, to allow them to function. Also, how they extort drug dealers to reap off benefits from selling drugs, and how they brutally comes to the barrios to either have massive arrests or in hot pursuit. No wonder why in the Dominican Republic, National Police is responsible for 16 to 80% of national homicides. Let me see if I can buy that. This is the chart. And again, the 2012 doesn't show the increasing tendency because it's an incomplete data. So as all these dynamics are like hidden transcript endorsed by a violent environment that results from a tense intergenerational cohabitation, plague of disempowerment, abuse, sequestration, violation. As I just mentioned, around these subverted discourses, institutional violent responses are also practiced and fed by perception of the other as criminal, violent, indifferent, lost, and irrelevant. From this finding, I argue that the type of criminality that has penetrated these and other Caribbean societies embraces and produces transgressive ecosystem as alternative social orders in which complex criminality behaves very different from ordinary ones. Now, to the degree in which these transgressive social orders purposefully court and incorporate agents of the state, they propel statetropism, a similar heliotropic tendency shown by plants when looking for the sunlight. Since drug dealers are the main producers of money in the barrios, they become the main target for police extortion and for being robbed. So among residents, there is a widespread certitude that the police is still involved in illicit business. As a systemic pattern of behavior, Statetropic criminality prefers any scenario in which civil servants at high, medium, and lower levels serve and are benefited by illicit and criminal activities. Statetropic power brokers generate profits and facilitates political influence to public officials and political elites in exchange of alliance and coverage for illicit activities. I asked the participants of the focus groups how those interactions between criminal and police members affect them as community organizers. Some confirmed that human rights violations have increased in the last 10 years. The intimidation comes not only from violent local groups, they said, but basically from the police. And according to the people I interviewed, those groups are articulated to other sectors at all levels of the state. In the Dominican Republic, the response of the community leader was also loud and clear. They are better organized than the state, they say. They replace the state, assuming a state-like responsibility. That's what the people in the community think about the narco-traffickers and the violent actors. Another participant declared that the state cannot end the drug trafficking because the drug trafficking is the state. All this in turn put the state in the untenable position of being nominally the enforcer of the law and at the same time an instrument exploited by criminal forces. The exact form that statetropism takes varies according to the particularity of each state and society. Sometimes the state itself becomes the organizer of transgressive actions and alternative political and social orders by explicitly transferring function and resources to non-state actors. That happens in Trinidad and Tobago and in Jamaica, as you probably will know, with the case of voodoo coke and other cases, very prominent cases. And also in Puerto Rico and Haiti, where street gangs, organized crime groups, and other criminal entities have become part of the political system, establishing clear alliances with political parties members and sectors of the state, which in turn transfer welfare resources to holders of local powers that help the government to establish political control in garrison areas. In the Dominican Republic, on the contrary, there was no welfare state involved in redistribution as in these other nations. The Dominican state was essentially functioning as under repressive forms. So the absence of the Dominican state from many areas of activity left space for NGOs, the church, and community-based organizations to assume welfare and other functions since 1960s. More recently, gangs have conquered this social and economic space, leading to the evolution of transgressive ecosystem, as already noted. In short, the absence of institutionalization in the Dominican Republic opened the door to informal and opportunistic alliances among state and private actors, and thus define the particular form of statetropism in that country. The phenomenon of statetropism is taken as a given at the micro level within the poor barrios of Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico, where there is a widespread certitude that the police are directly involved in illicit business, above all, drugs. It also explains the reluctance of residents to cooperate with the police, for example, by informing where the points are, and residents commonly assume that any information they deliver to the police will filter back to the criminals, putting them in danger. Now, at the macro level, statetropic power brokers generate profits and facilitate political influence to public officials and political elites in exchange for protection of their illicit activities. For that, it is worth to remark that statetropism, especially at the macro level, is a crucial condition to grant consistency and robustness to illicit flow, making almost impossible for the criminality to capitalize without disorientation. That means that police autonomy, partisan fragmentation, and violent competition among criminal actors are fundamental precursors of statetropism and transgressive ecosystems. But they are also indicators of other indicators of the intensity of the phenomena. Just to mention some of those indicators, one is hypercorruption, which is an important indicator of statetropism, especially that it relates to organized crime And a proxy of these are the constant purge of military and police members in the Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic police institution. And as an illustration of that, in 2011, a report issued by the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice highlighted that, and I'm going to quote, the amount of crime and corruption involving the Puerto Rican police officers further illustrated that the Puerto Rican police is an agency in profound disrepair. From January 2005 to November 2010, there were more than 1,709 arrests of Puerto Rican police officers. The charges vary widely from the thief and simple assault to rape, drug trafficking, and murder. Second, another indicator of how people perceive the level of embeddedness of complex criminality and its statetropic orientation is reflected in the next chart that shows the poor confidence that Dominicans have in the justice system, the police, and the political party at the end. Those are the lowest ones. A third indicator is the declining confidence of Dominicans in the capacity of the state to combat corruption and to improve security, as shown in this chart. The correlation between corruption and insecurity regarding support to the system, to the democratic system, is reflected in this other graph that shows a decline of at least 10 points of support to the democratic regime because increasing perception of corruption and insecurity. Clearly, both phenomenon undermines any attempt to reform state agencies and impedes the implementation of effective public policy. I just wanted to finish pointing out that ultimately the implication of these trends at the micro and micro level traduce itself in the concomitant decline of people's support to the democratic regime and to the political system, as you can see here in this graphic in the case of the Dominican Republic. Although there's still a slight decreasing in the support to the democracy, there is still a decline. So just to wrap up, in terms of recommendations, very general recommendation from this scenario, many lessons can be extracted related to policy design and implementation. And I'm not going to go into that, but this lesson should help policymakers to assess in more flexible and consistent ways complex scenarios of chronic violence and criminality in vulnerable places. They also should promote more inclusive and better articulated forms of engagement and co-responsibility. So in terms of policy design and implementation, there are three fundamental policy levels of incidents that need to be taken into account when delineating strategies of intervention. First, there is the macro level. Second, the micro, local level. And third, there is the level of intersection and articulation between them. This distinction means that a policy that is designed to work at the macro level will have different implications on the micro-local level, and it is fundamental to understand where and how they both intersect and impact each other. For example, it would be counterintuitive to carry a comprehensive reform of the incarceration system if the punitive response is the only one that comes in hands when dealing with petty crimes and minor infractions, potential arrests. Likewise, to be more effective, crime prevention and control policies need to depart from the contextual specificities, taking into account the particular social, spatial, institutional, and organizational settings. And this is all that I have for today, and I'm ready to take your question or your impressions or your opinions.
Great.
Thanks for
well, thank you very much, Dr. Bobea. And while our guests are entering their questions into the chat box at the bottom of their screens, and I encourage you all to do so now, I have a question so that admittedly this is not my area, but in based on these transgressive ecosystems, how do other theories like the adaptation and theories of resilience, how do they relate to that, or how are they connected with these transgressive ecosystems?
Well, that's a good question, and my tentative response is that even when process of adaptation to organized crime could become more embedded into the social fabric and the state structure, as I presented, they also promote resilience in a rather dynamic sense and tends to those agents interaction. There are several studies on resilience. There are, for people that are interested, there are like scholars like uh, uh, Diane Davis and Keith Konings and David Rogers that works on resilience and adaptation. And they emphasize a cumulative process of learning and deploying collective action, which is crucial to address conditions of chronic violence within vulnerable population. So in my view, resilience is a recursive behavior that cannot be reduced to just to to isolated process, but it's basically a synergetic result of conflicting and colluding forces and between capacities and resources. So the scenario is not necessarily one of mutually cohesiveness, but of navigation of formal and informal institutions. So this means that communities are not like blanket blanket slate spaces. They are rather the product of previous accommodation, traumas, and displacements, and they learn from those processes. Consequential innovation, crises, and tipping point momentums are also catalytics for responses that can break those kind of behaviors, negative behavior that I mentioned here. So in conclusion, as organized violence and crime have become more systematically embedded into the social fabric on Puerto Rican and Dominicans and in the state too, these societies has also become more resilient by developing survival mechanisms, adaptive capacity, and deploying social arrangement that allow them to adjust to new social and local orders.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question, but actually this is with our own Dr. Gail McGarity. She talks, her question is about the perceptions of the other, the outgroups in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rican context. Is racial profiling one of those that are more pronounced of African descent, a facet of the stereotyping of criminals in both of these contexts?
I would say yes. I mean, there are different uh, different, let's say, factors that enter into the otherness. As you know, I mean, as I mentioned, for example, poverty, marginalization, the peripheralization of that population in itself constitute one sign or one factor of otherness. And in the case of Puerto Rico, actually, I would say that I saw that in a more striking way than I saw it in the Dominican Republic, because there is more, in my view, more stratification and segmentation in terms of the space, especially the segregation. In terms of racial, that accounts too. I mean, despite the fact that in the case of the Dominican Republic, it's a very mixed mulatto, white, Afro-American descendants, Afro-Antillean descendants, still the people that are the more darker, the people that are like in Puerto Rico too, they are the ones that are confined to the more marginalized and deprived communities, and they are the ones that are the subject of persecution. And the other day with Puerto Rican friends and a professor, and he was telling me precisely how there had been massive migration of white Puerto Ricans to United States, and so he was saying, well, Puerto Rico is becoming more, you know, it's not only more segmented, but also more poor and more black there is more the tendency to stigmatize and to marginalize more in terms of race, definitely.
Well, if I could dovetail kind of off that, I'm always looking for how this applies to other countries, and particularly the U.S. Do you think that this attraction of the statetropism, as you describe it in Caribbean countries, how do you see that as applying to other countries across the Caribbean or even the United States?
Definitely, I think it's something that you can see in other countries in the Caribbean. I mentioned the case of Trinidad, the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the case of Jamaica, even Suriname. Definitely the two countries that I'm talking about. But in Latin American too. I mean, Latin American countries, you see these more and more penetration of organized crime in at the different level of the states, and the process of deterioration of not only enforcement forces like police and the military, but also the judicial system and the penal system, the incarceration system. There is the selling, buying of sentence in many of the judge, and there is no doubt something that you can see throughout Central America and other Latin American countries. In the case of the United States, I do think that you can basically talk about some levels of that in some places. But I will say that it's not necessarily as pronounced as you can see, or doesn't occur in the same pattern that you see in the case of Latin America. And this is important distinction to make, because there is always a tendency to try to understand even democracy, or understand, our democracies, our Latin American democracies in the light of U.S. democracy or the Western liberal democracy. And we have to keep in mind that in these countries, in Latin American countries, the state was formed in a different, not only show a different configuration that in the liberal Western states, but also the practices, the way that that democracy was installed in these countries is very different in terms of the weakness of their institutions, in terms of the kind of dynamic of these institutions. So I will say, responding your question, that to me it's something that I'm sure that you can apply some level of this framework to study certain levels in the United States, like in the case of Puerto Rico, but no doubt that there will be places that resemble Puerto Rico in the United States. But I will say that it requires a different kind of framework. And my point is precisely that it is important to understand the local and the specific dynamics, how they interact, and how they become with a different kind of arrangements in different places.
Okay, and just one more question, if we may. With the statetropism, in your view, what are the biggest problems and conversely the biggest benefits of statetropism as a non-liberal form of redistribution of power and or social resources?
Well, that's also a tricky question. I definitely, when I approached the study and when I came up with my conclusions about statetropism, I definitely try not to be judgmental and putting the good or bad in order to explore the reality more free way, free environment. But definitely, I think it has a negative connotation, and the negative connotation I presented actually at the end of my presentation, I was showing how precisely the Statetropism as a form of reinforced, not only reinforced forms of inequality and abusive interaction between state, and not only state, also private sector, I must say, because Statetropism, even though it sort of refers to the orientation of criminality, complex criminality toward the state, and vice versa, how the state reorganized criminality, it also involves private sectors that are related to the state. And basically what this kind of pattern reproduce is more inequality, more autonomy for unregulated actors, violent actors, to monopolize violence and to concentrate violence in their hands. And also to have to make influence in decision and in power. So I think that what we need to think about is precisely how to find the ways of how to counteract these tendencies of the Statetropism to get what one scholar, very known scholar, John Bailey, that works in these issues of crime and violence, called a positive equilibrium instead of a negative equilibrium, which refers basically to the relationship between the state and society, and looking for positive structure of opportunity to create a more equal and more inclusive systems. Definitely, a Statetropism is, to me, is not a way of redistributing social goods or service. On the contrary, it's a way of concentrated in a more brutal and in a more aggressive way.
Great. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lilian Bobea. And on behalf of the CKC Director, Mr. Carl Prenzo, I'd like to sincerely extend our appreciation and thanks to Dr. Bobea for sharing here today. Just a reminder to everybody, please look at the lower left-hand corner of your screen and you'll see a couple more speaker series events. You can also find more events on the CKC website. Recording of this presentation will be available on CKC's YouTube channel just as soon as I can process it. Just go to youtube.com, search for Cultural Knowledge, all one word, and you'll also find a link to it on our website. On the CKC portal, you can find the CKC blog, contact information, discussion forums, and other resources. And remember, this is the new CKC web portal. It's at ckc.army.mil. If you have a topic that you'd like to present during the speaker series or know someone that does, please email or call us. You can find me at speakers or info at culturalknowledge.org. Thank you very much again, Dr. Bobea, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.
Thank you.